joining us today, and thank you to all our witnesses. This is meeting number 15 of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources. And I'm glad to see we have 3 witnesses with us today, and we're joining us virtually. Just to let you know the process, because this is a virtual meeting, there's things, they run very smoothly where we've all gotten the hang of it, but there can be little bumps along the way. I believe you've been briefed on the technical aspects of your participation, but at the bottom of your screen, you should have a little button that says English, French, which you can use for translation. There's a mute button, which you should keep on unless you are speaking or answering questions. And because we're on Zoom, when people are talking, if they could just let people finish before they start talking, it's easier for all of us, but it's particularly easier for the interpreters. So I thank everybody in advance for their patience. And to the witnesses, you each have 5 minutes to make your opening remarks. One of my jobs is to keep track of time, which necessitates me interrupting you sometimes if we're going over the time limit on your initial presentation or with respect to question and answers after. So I will apologize for that in advance. And I will then open the floor to, well, we have 3 witnesses. We have Professor Coates from the University of Saskatchewan. We have the Cree Nation Government and Grand Chief Abel Bossum. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, sir. And from Rio Tinto, we have Nigel Stewart. So Professor Coates, why don't we start with you, sir?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to committee members. It's a real privilege to have the chance to speak to you. I'm assuming you can hear me okay.
We can.
The issue of mineral supply and uncertainty in the Canadian mining industry is one of critical importance to the country as a whole. And let me start off with this observation that there's somehow this general perception as we look at important issues of climate change and economic retrenchment, that somehow the resource sector is in decline. The reality is very, very different. In fact, with the imperatives of 2021, we have solar and wind power installations, mass digitization, transit development, electric vehicle production. We're investing billions of dollars in renewing our energy infrastructure. In fact, what we have is a higher priority than ever on rapid and reliable, cost-effective mineral production. So let me divide my comments into 2 areas. One is disadvantages and concerns, and the other one is sort of opportunities and advantages that Canada faces. So very quickly, obviously, the uncertainty of the Chinese market in terms of mineral production and demand is critical. There's a very strong disconnect between the environmental movement in Canada and internationally, and its kind of anti-development instincts in mineral production that costs an awful lot of time and energy. We underestimate the scale and intensity of global mineral demand. I spend a lot of time in Asia, and the escalation in demand is dramatic, particularly in critical mineral sectors because of the computerization and what have you. We also have to address in Canada that we're not alone in this game, that there are many supply options, particularly in the developing world. And those areas, they have more complex issues, sometimes less favorable environments for human rights protections and environmental protections and what have you. In Canada, we have some serious shortcomings in northern infrastructure. It's limited. It takes too long to develop. We move very slowly in that regard. I'm very concerned about the regulatory burden and the time to development. We have this idea in Canada. I was talking to some folks in Ottawa, officials in Ottawa, who seem to constantly suggest that the length of time it takes to make a decision is a proxy for a good decision, that a longer time frame actually necessitates a better decision. Not convinced of that, and I think there's some good evidence running counter to that. I think we're also overly sensitive to criticism about resource development. This is a key priority for Canada, and we have to find a middle ground. I think part of this is let's talk openly about what happens with our current system, the costs of delays, the time required to get permission, the direct expenses involved for companies, and how that adds to their total cost of structures, and the scale of abandoned and deferred investments. We're losing a lot of opportunity because we're becoming less competitive. And we have to also find a way to sort of stop redrafting our regulations and requirements. We have fairly imprecise guidance from some pieces of our legislation at the federal, territorial, provincial sort of level. And I think we also need to sort of reconcile the reality of Canada as a natural resource superpower with the lack of national commitment to the field. We don't see resource development as being particularly attractive or compelling these days. And I think it's fair to say that our country's urban areas, which are very powerful and very appropriately powerful, are disconnected from the sector. So what are the other side? What about the advantages and opportunities in the natural resource sector and mineral developments and critical mineral developments? We have some of the best discovered and potential mineral deposits in the world, including in sort of some of the more rare earth minerals and things of that sort. Canada has the minerals this country needs and wants. Put aside my comments about the decision-making process, put them in one box for a second, and look at the outcomes. The outcomes are that our regulatory and environmental standards are actually first-rate and very appropriate. How we get to those standards may be sort of questionable, but we can do better on the decision-making and the development sort of structure, but we do really well on setting the baseline in terms of environmental protection, social, cultural protection. To a degree that we don't talk about enough, Canada has the most impressive mining sector in the world. We have enormous access to capital. We have remarkable technical expertise. There's a global reach for what we do as a sector, and our corporate structures are quite flexible. And let me deal with one that I think is really important. I know we're going to have a chief speaking to this more directly than I will. But the engagement and participation of Indigenous peoples, you'll notice I did not put that as a barrier. In contrast to the standard explanation, Indigenous communities are not a major barrier. They're simply not. There are hundreds of agreements and some truly impressive partnerships. In your committees, I suspect you've been talking to about Voisey Bay in Labrador, Cameco in Saskatchewan, the Tahltan First Nation in British Columbia, Frontenac First Nation in the Yukon. The country should not blame Indigenous communities for delays. So let me quickly wind up with strategies for where we can go from here. How do we protect the environment, respect Indigenous aspirations, encourage investment? How do we do this properly? Number one, I would invite the Government of Canada to sit down with Indigenous communities and mining representatives and to review the regulatory regimes. We need to be a world leader in appropriate and expeditious project review and approval. We're not that right now. We can do much better. Let's focus on creating opportunities for Indigenous equity in the mining sector. Provide Indigenous communities with a seat at the table. You'll discover that the decision-making processes improve quite dramatically. Let's talk openly. I would think the Standing Committee is an excellent example of this. Let's talk openly about the nature of critical minerals, explain the global market requirements, talk to the country about how important the mineral sector is in the 21st century economy and the particular value of critical minerals, absolutely essential. Let's also talk about the fact that these resources are absolutely critical.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up now, Professor Coates.
I will do that very quickly, and thank you very much. I would simply say the irony of our times is that the pursuit of rapid technological change and innovation requires a strengthening and empowerment of our nation's resource economy. To do anything slower than that will actually hold us up economically. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor. Okay, Grand Chief Bossom, how about you go next, sir? You are still on mute. There you go.
Good morning. That seems to be a common error on my part. Good morning again. I would first of all like to express my appreciation for being asked to participate in this committee hearing. This is certainly a topic that we welcome, as it has important implications on the way which Canada broadly deals with situations which there is an intersection of resource development proposals and Indigenous traditional lands. As you may know, the territory of UHG in James Bay region, north of Quebec, comprises of approximately 400,000 square kilometers. And this territory has over the years been the object of many resource development projects in the sectors of energy, mining, and forestry. Indeed, it was the announcement of the James Bay hydroelectric project in the 1970s that created the circumstances of of negotiating the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, which was signed in 1975. This agreement is our treaty, and we have over the past 45 years built upon our treaty to gradually expand the role and the jurisdiction of our communities within our traditional territory, while at the same time improving the living conditions of our people. The province of Quebec has historically positioned itself to become an investment-friendly province for the mining industry. By and large, the mining industry has found Quebec to have a favorable regulatory and financial landscape that has been inviting to many mining companies to explore and develop mines. Currently, as in many places throughout Canada and elsewhere, there is a significant drive to identify, explore, and develop mines to bring to market those metals and minerals that will have a significant role to play in the production of batteries with very substantial capacity for storage of electricity. Vanadium, which exists in a number of places within our traditional territory, is one such metal. There are also within our traditional territory several very active operations engaged in exploration and development of lithium, an element that has widespread use in current battery technology. Because much of the world's deposit of lithium are concentrated in less politically stable countries, there has been particular interest in identifying and exploiting the lithium deposits found in Quebec. There are currently 5 lithium projects that are at the various stages of review and environmental assessment in our region. And there has been significant talk about the potential of our region actually becoming the battery of the North. What we are witnessing and what we are becoming, what's becoming the focal point of is the convergence of a shift to cleaner energy, the greening of industry operations, the growing environmental consciousness of consumers, the search for strategic minerals, and the recognition that Indigenous peoples may indeed have a serious contribution to make to our collective understanding and thinking about sustainable development. Cree Nation of EUSG have spent many decades struggling with both the province and the federal governments to secure acknowledgements of our Indigenous rights and our treaty rights, and is now open to serious engagement with resource development proponents wishing to carry out activities in our traditional territory. We have secured the recognition by Quebec that all resource development projects proposed to take place in our traditional territory must go through the social environmental impact assessment process outlined in our treaty, a process which must take into account our people's environmental and social concerns, and which result in our involvement in such proposed projects, including environmental monitoring, employment, training, contracting, and financial benefits. We're at a point now where we have built and maintained a relationship with Quebec in the spirit of cooperation and with the objective of creating opportunities for our people and bringing home the benefits. The latest example of this can be found in the February 20 La Grande Alliance, an MOU which we signed with Premier Legault that creates a network of Cree and government organizations working together on a design and implementation of protected areas, transportation, communication, and energy infrastructure to achieve a balance promised under the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. We have much work ahead of us, but this new approach can shift the paradigm that has for too long imposed challenges in balancing development and protecting our traditional territory that remains central to the livelihood of our Cree Nation. As the La Grande Alliance MOU demonstrates, we are open to engaging with mining industry, an engagement in the context of our treaty and the environmental and social impact assessment regimes embedded in our treaty. It is through this regime that we assess the social acceptability of the projects, and it is through this regime that we give expression to the notion of free, prior, and informed consent. Since the signing of the...
Chief, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up very quickly. Thank you.
Since the signing of our treaty in 1975, through the openness engagement, we have concluded over 80 agreements of all nature. We've argued for many years that the full recognition of Indigenous rights is not a threat to development, but instead it is the necessary condition for orderly and sustainable development to take place. By incorporating our rights into the development equation and by finding the right mix between rights, development, and governance, we have repeatedly created a win-win situation for our people, our communities, for our industry, for our region, and for Quebec as a whole. This must surely be a way for the future if we are ever to get beyond the dead ends of paternalism and colonialism.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stewart, over to you, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee and fellow witnesses. My name is Nigel Stewart and I'm the head of Group Technical for processing for Rio Tinto worldwide. Rio Tinto is the second largest mining company in the world and the largest mining company in Canada, with operations coast to coast to coast, from our world-class aluminium operations in Kitimat in British Columbia and in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region, to our Diavik diamond mine in the Northwest Territories, to our iron ore operations in Labrador. We have a truly national footprint with exploration activities across the country. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this important topic of critical minerals with you today. As Pierre Gratton pointed out in his earlier testimony to the committee, Canada's mining and manufacturing sector will be critical to achieving the federal government's 2030 climate change goals and the transition to a zero carbon future by 2050. Rio Tinto has climate targets for 2030 in line with the Paris Agreement, and our goal is to reach net zero emissions in our operations by 2050. We don't know what that path to 2050 looks like yet, but we know it will and must include a secure supply of critical minerals, be they battery metals such as lithium, cobalt, and copper, or rare earth metals like scandium, or other critical elements like gallium. Today, I would like to focus my remarks on what Rio Tinto likes to call full value mining. When we think of mining, we immediately think of primary mining or greenfield plays, but increasingly, we are discovering that many of the critical minerals we need to facilitate this clean transition can and are being found in existing mining operations, in waste streams and mine tailings. So full value mining is all about extracting as much value as possible from the ore bodies that we mine. In our aluminium operations in Quebec, for example, we have invested many years of R&D to create a new process which basically separates out our residues into their component parts. We've been able to monetize what would have been deemed a waste in the past. So there is both an economic and an environmental benefit. Today in our aluminium business in Quebec, 85% of the 400,000 tons of waste is now actually fully recovered in the form of multiple products that are sent to customers. Another great example of full value mining is what we've been able to do at our Rio Tinto Fer and Titans metallurgical facility in Sorel-Tracy in Quebec, which extracts high quality titanium dioxide feedstock, iron, steel, and metal powders, all from ilmenite. Using our processing know-how and R&D capabilities, we have figured out a way to extract scandium, one of the rarest critical minerals. We do this from our waste streams. In January, we announced that Rio Tinto will become the first producer of high-quality scandium oxide in North America, with the construction of a new commercial-scale demonstration plant. Scandium provides us with an alloying element for aluminium. It creates new possibilities for scandium aluminium alloy products in applications like aerospace and defense, because scandium is unique and it's one of the few elements that increases both strength and toughness of aluminium alloys. Rio Tinto is investing $6 million in the construction of the first module in the plant, with an initial capacity to produce 3 tons of scandium oxide per year, or approximately 20% of the current global market. Those are just 2 Canadian examples of how we're pushing the boundaries of traditional mining to extract the full value from the mineral stream. We have other examples in the US as well, including a pilot project of a boron mine in California that will extract lithium from a waste stream there. At the end of the day, we need steel, aluminium, copper, cobalt, titanium. All of these elements are necessary for our collective growth and well-being. As miners, our job is not only to find these minerals, but to extract them in as sustainable way as possible. It is the desire, along with the recognition that we cannot address the challenge of climate change without minerals and metals, that pushes us more and more towards full value mining, with the lowest environmental and carbon footprint possible. Many thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the witnesses. Okay, so let's start with our first round of questions for 6 minutes each, and I believe we're starting with Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. My first question for Professor Coates. You raised a number of really important points. You know, this isn't a critical mineral mine, but there's a mine fairly close to my community, and you know, they come under provincial and federal jurisdiction. And recently, you know, the federal jurisdiction says if you want to increase by more than 50%, then you're subject to the federal impact assessment, versus if it was under 50%, you'd be subject to the Alberta Energy Review. And in their case, you know, they sought to expand by about 49%, so maybe playing pretty close to the line, and they were subject to a federal review. And, you know, lately this has been kind of compounding and causing, you know, temporary job losses and delays. I wonder if you could talk about, you know, what is the impact you've seen of the new impact assessment agency on getting mining projects going in Canada?
Well, thank you, sir. I guess my first observation would be, in one sense, it's early days. The mining regime was brought in. It wasn't overly specific. It sort of set out more broad contours, and it's a work in progress. Resource companies that I've been talking about in recent years have talked about the sort of flexibility of the IA process, the fact that the federal officials are looking for ways to improve it and looking at ways to sort of see it actually implement. I would lump that process, though, into a sort of a 15-year history of what I call sort of over-regulation of the industry. We have this idea that somehow if we do more and more regulation and more surveys and more evaluations, that it will result in sort of somewhat better outcomes. I think that's still a testable proposition and not necessarily one that's been proven yet. We spend a phenomenal amount of money investigating these opportunities. It takes a lot of time to do it. A lot of that money that goes in doesn't go to the local community, doesn't go to the local First Nation, doesn't go to even the province. It goes to sort of broader entities. So I'm really concerned, to be honest. I think we should look at expediting the outcomes a lot faster, and focusing on the final product. Are we actually getting safer and better mines? We do really well in producing safe mines. We do really well in ameliorating some of the social cultural effects. But I'm not sure that the length and time and cost of the regulation is the cause of those more positive outcomes.
Thank you, Professor. My next question, I might come back to you, is for Mr. Stewart from Rio Tinto. I found your testimony regarding the waste, going through the waste and finding new resources of scandium oxide. And I'm just wondering, can you comment on any of the regulatory hurdles that might exist in going into waste? Is there a regulatory advantage into looking at waste, or is it easier to get into more greenfield projects?
Well, I think we just look at the existing sort of environmental sort of legislation that we have in an operating site when we're processing our tailings, and make sure that we're complying with those those regulations that exist, and that we're informing the regulatory authorities of what we're doing, and that we have the permission to do what we do. But generally, it's quicker because you're already operating within an existing permitting environment, so it makes it sort of much easier and much quicker.
Given that Rio Tinto is it's a global mining company, and this waste idea seems like it's a very high potential idea. In terms of supplying, you said 20% of global supply of scandium. If Canada is only or is primarily going the route of, going through tailings, are we going to be left behind, or do we need a combination of this tailings idea and new greenfield projects? Like, what's going to create the supply that's needed to ensure the world is supplied by Canadian critical minerals?
I think most likely we're going to have both. But the reason, 3 tons doesn't seem very much, but it's still 20% of the global supply when you start talking about rare earths, right? So the issue for us is always about when you bring supply on stream, because you can actually flood the market, depress the price, and put yourself out of business. So that's one of the issues that we face with a lot of these critical minerals at the moment, because they're growing. The quantities are very small. The pricing of that commodity is very, very volatile. So it's matching supply to demand. So this is kind of what we have to do, is match supply to demand. So we have the ability to grow, but you need to start somewhere.
Now, you're talking about, getting gallium, scandium, these things from the waste tailings. Is Rio Tinto, currently in planning stages to start greenfield projects to find rare earth minerals in Canada? And if not, why not?
Not at the moment, because we're finding a lot of materials actually that are very important for the for the future economy and to support climate change. Within our existing streams, so we're focusing there first. I think one of the big challenges is if you go and look for deposits of rare earths, by their very nature, they come in sort of very, very small concentrations. So you end up having to deal with, you then present yourselves with the environmental issue of what to do with all of the waste you generate. So that's kind of why, from our perspective, why we're looking at how do we keep our footprint very, very small, but still provide these critical minerals and metals for the future.
Thanks, Mr. Stewart. Thanks, Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Weiler, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining our committee meeting today. Really fascinating discussion already. I'd like to pick up where my colleague left off here with Mr. Stewart. I was wondering if you could speak to the minerals and metals that you don't currently extract in Canada, critical minerals that you don't currently extract in Canada, whether that's from greenfield development or from existing waste streams that you see as an opportunity to expand it in the future.
There's kind of a long list. Well, many of them fundamentally, we just haven't sort of found viable deposits in Canada yet through our exploration efforts. So I think that's one of the reasons why some of them aren't actually sort of extracted here by us. And I think the challenge of what we do with all of the waste is becoming more and more of a preoccupation, I think, for us as well as for society, right? So this is really why we're sort of focusing on looking at what we already have within our portfolio, within our ore bodies, within our streams that we can extract. So that actually means that the material is here, but it's not necessarily in a new mine. It's actually within our own processes first. So we're looking on our own doorstep to see what we can do to solve this problem and to support the economy and the growth of the green economy. That's just the choice that we've made at the moment.
And I was hoping you could also speak to a little bit of the challenges of both finding and then actually extracting these critical minerals from existing, whether that's waste rock or other mine products.
Sorry, I don't quite follow your question.
So I was hoping you could speak, maybe I'll reframe that a little bit, to the process. If you could speak to the process of extracting these critical minerals from some of the existing deposits, or whether that's waste rock from existing operations that you have.
Okay. Sometimes we can find them in the tailings themselves, but more often what we find is that they actually separate out and become available in the processing of the core mineral that we're trying to extract. So, for example, you might have a liquor at some point in your process that contains a high amount of gallium or a high amount of scandium. So this is what we're doing, for example, in the case of scandium in Rio Tinto Fer and Titan in Sorel Tracy. It's there in solution in one part of our process, and we're actually extracting it rather than sending it out to a tailings facility. Similarly, we can find in the extraction of alumina from bauxite in our aluminium business, we can find in what we call the Bayer liquor. So after we've dissolved all of the alumina into the liquor, we can actually pick up gallium and vanadium, for example, that are co-dissolved at the same time. So we can put processes in place that actually extract the material then. And we're doing similar things, for example, in the United States in copper at our facility in Salt Lake City, Rio Tinto Kennecott Copper, where we're looking at extracting things like rhenium and tellurium above all of the other things that we extract there. So not only do we extract copper, for example, from that ore body, we also extract gold, silver, and molybdenum and lead. So it's looking at what more can we extract within our existing processes rather than sending all of those elements to tailings.
Very, very interesting. And as the second largest mining company in the world, do you find this is a similar process that's happening in Rio Tinto and in all the countries that it operates in to really be able to extract some of these rare earth elements from existing operations?
I think we're kind of leading the way and leading the conversation on this at the moment. But increasingly it is getting attention for good reason. And I think we'll see more and more people doing it.
And for you mentioned earlier your project to extract scandium in Quebec. You mentioned that this would be 20% of the world's supply in this. Mm-hmm. Do you find that for these operations and other operations for rare earth elements that you have that demand that's really driving this, or what's some of the main drivers to look at some of these new projects that you're working on?
I think really at the end of the day is demand, and it's encouraging the demand for the projects. That's absolutely key. Without demand, we won't be extracting these materials. So, and we need to be very cognizant of what's happening in the world. When new applications are coming in place, where future applications might become, so we, might come into place, so that we can actually start to serve those markets going forward. So, for us, it's really all about the demand and what society will need for the future. And to create that sort of a greener future and a more sustainable future for us as a society.
Great. Well, thank you for that. My next question for Grant, the Grand Chief, you mentioned that the Cree Nations have put together a specific environmental assessment process that you've been able to apply for different natural resource developments within your territories. And I was hoping you could just kind of speak at a high level of how that process works.
And you have about 30 seconds to answer that question.
Okay. Well, in the James Bay Agreement, Section 22 deals with the environmental impact assessment process, and it's a process that involves Quebec, Canada, and the Cree in the process, and has a pretty rigorous consultation process. And so any project that goes through that is dealt with by the people in the community. They have a chance to not only hear about it, but also to recommend ways to improve if they feel that they have a negative impact on the environment. And so, the objective is to not only get a approval from the environmental and economic perspective, but also to obtain social acceptability by the people.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Weiler. Okay, over to Mr. Simard.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a brief question for Mr. Stewart, and I want to make sure that the interpretation is coming through clearly before I ask my question. Oh, I understand French quite well, Mr. Simard. Okay, very well. I'm not far from Arvida. It's in my neighborhood. My father worked there for a while before it was bought out. I have a few questions on the development of aluminum. It's very important for my region. And I would say that in your presentation, you spoke of the value-added extractions. And I think that's a very important point because a lot of witnesses have appeared telling us that insofar as critical minerals is concerned, what was the most important part was the value chain. That is further processing and perhaps tertiary processing. It's all very well to extract the primary ore, but then again, sometimes it's shipped off to China and they get the benefit of creating jobs. Over the last 30 years, we've been talking about secondary, tertiary processing of various metals and ores. Rio Tinto has never taken a firm commitment on that. Well, in fact, we had an aluminum area, which smelter or processing plant that, in fact, was decommissioned. Now, there needs to be some kind of formal commitment to the cluster effect of secondary, tertiary production. Could you offer us any reassurances, guarantees that you're going to respect value-added extraction and that you're in a position to sustain the development of critical minerals in Quebec? Well, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Simon. In terms of processing, we do most of the processing in our aluminum refineries. Pellets, slabs, ingots, sheets of aluminum. But unfortunately, in supporting this type of activity, we have to be close to the market, to the client, and mostly they're in the Midwest and the United States. Our clients are mostly via Toronto, for example. But if we take the example of scandium, for example, well, the oxides of scandium were developed at Tracy. And this is value added for the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean area as well at Quebec. This is where we have this alloy. We create the alloy there, and that's what we sell on the market. No, I've been following it very closely, Mr. Stewart. I'd like to add just a few points. The processing or transformation secondary occurs in the United States, and we have to pay a premium there. I think that Rio Tinto would have a valid role so that at least its cost would be less for producers or suppliers in Quebec and perhaps give new life to secondary and tertiary processing. I don't know if you've thought of that, perhaps. Well, what I'm going to say applies to the entirety of the mining sector per se. If we take a look at what's happening in Lac-Saint-Jean, Saguenay, it's a first in the world for the electrolysis. And it's very, very important for the aluminum ward. This is the first time it's ever been done anywhere in the world. And it is supported by the Government of Canada, the Government of Quebec, as you may well know. We're doing it in cooperation with Alcoa and Alco. This is going to be a fantastic gain for the industry. I have a further question for Chief Bolsom, if I may. I very much appreciated your presentation. We often read that Indigenous communities have a lot to teach us on environmental issues. You came back on the Bay James Agreement. We could also have spoke La Paix des Braves, which gave rise to quite a cooperation. You said you had 5 partnerships dealing with lithium. I've seen the Quebec plan. 90 million was invested for 2015 to 2020, rather. What could the federal government contribute to try to add more value or to generate more activity on these 5 projects in Quebec?
We've in dealing with these 5 companies, we've established good cooperation with the people that are occupying the land, and that's really important. And when we talk about Cree rights, those are the people that we're referring to, and they have a lot to say in the process. And when they get involved right at the beginning of a process, even at an exploration stage, they learn about the exploration activities. Most of the time, they make a contribution by sharing the knowledge they have about the land, and so you build this this trust at a very early stage in the process between the people that are occupying the land, between the leadership and the industry. And so and I think that this is certainly what has worked for us. One of the things that we are now sitting down with the government of Quebec is trying to design the
Chief, I apologize. I'm going to have to interrupt, but we're over time already, so we'll have to move on. Maybe you can come back to that in the next round. Okay, Mr. Canning's over to you.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to thank the witnesses here today. And I think I'd just like to give Grand Chief Bosom a chance to continue on in that vein, but in particular, I was interested in hearing your comments, Grand Chief, about the impact assessment process that you have developed in the Cree agreement. I guess that dates back to the James Bay Agreement. I know my former colleague Romeo Saganash was involved for many years with that. And perhaps you could tell us more about that impact assessment process, maybe with some comment on what Professor Coates was talking about, how some of these impact assessment processes go on needlessly, take too long. Is there some sense that your process in the James Bay area is more, I don't want to say streamlined, but does it save time to speak to the people on the land? Well, I'll let you just answer there, and I have probably some follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Canyons. So just to continue, what I was about to say is that recently we signed the Memorandum of Understanding with Mr. Legault with the objective of trying to balance resource development and from some of the traditional Cree concerns related to environment and lands. And of course, the question was always, how do you facilitate development in the territory? And so, what we must understand is that the land and the environment are central to Cree people and perhaps Indigenous people right across Canada. And so when you begin discussions, we find that it's always important to talk about the land and environment first. And that is one of the reasons why in the Memorandum of Understanding, you will see that our objective was to negotiate protected areas. Once you can identify these, protect them, then it's easier to look at where the infrastructure can go for resource development, and therefore minimize the impact of resource development, regardless of what it may be. So this is really a change in the way we've been doing. In the past, we've always been reacting to development. It comes to our door, and then we have to react. The MOU that we're looking at is really to design for the next 30 years what Northern Quebec could look like, where the Cree people are active participants in it. And so while at the moment we're carrying out feasibility studies on the various type of infrastructure needs, both for industry and for our communities, at some point there will be a project, and I don't know what kind of project, but once it's defined as a project, then it is subject to the environmental impact assessment. And usually, if the project has been dealt with at the community level for some time, and people understand the project, and accept the project, then of course the environmental impact technical process is a little more easier to do because the industry either has reached an agreement with the community or the nation, and so there's acceptability. And so this regime that we have in Section 22 is really it helps not only process the project, but to define the project, and helps and allows, I guess, the CRE to participate if there are ways to improve it or to minimize the impact, so that at the end of the day, there's a win-win for the CRE people, the industries and the governments.
Well, thank you. Chair, how long do I have?
We got a minute and a half.
Okay, I think I'll move to Professor Coates and just follow up on that and talk about, your comments regarding impact assessments taking too long, that process without gaining value. These processes, I would say, are, a reaction to probably past disasters. We think of, the giant mine, which is in the news recently. And there's other examples of cleanups in the north, especially, say, Faro. Just comment on how you see improving that process so there is confidence. We have governments that want to create jobs. We have mining companies that want to make money. How do we create that confidence in the public that those concerns are being met, those impacts are being met? And why were they failing in the past?
Sorry, first off, thank you very much, sir, for the great question. You're absolutely right about the historical memory. Indigenous communities remember the very serious problems in the past. How do you get ahead of this? I think the Grand Chief has described something really important. Start the process really, really early on. And in fact, we put a lot of the burden on the back of the mining companies. Governments can play a major role in sort of going through northern Quebec, the Yukon, parts of northern Saskatchewan, reviewing the landscape ahead of time, figuring out where those no-go zones are. There are places that are culturally important, that are critical for harvesting. There's not going to be mining on those locations, like the Peel River. There were proposals for mining in the Peel River Valley. It took a decade to figure out that you couldn't go there. So if you can actually upfront all this potential conflict, talk ahead of time with the First Nations, where are the hunting grounds, where are the cultural sites, where are the places where we should go, do that work ahead of time. So the mining companies have a sort of a more clear tapestry as to where they can actually
operate.
Thank
you, Professor. I'm gonna have to interrupt you and stop you there. Okay, on to we're into the 5-minute round now, starting with Mr. Zimmer.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses. Thank you, Grand Chief, for being with us today. I appreciate what you've brought up. We have lots of potential here in Canada. And Chief, you talked about the potential investment that and potential of Indigenous communities benefiting from some of these developments, the mining developments. I'm up in northern BC with oil and gas. It's huge. It dramatically affects our Indigenous populations in a positive way, bringing economic activity to really everybody in the north. But we see this challenge. We heard from Mr. Coates that talked about this sort of endless delay in regulatory approval process. Just a simple question, and I'll start with the Chief. How can we do better as regulators to make this process better? And there's been other answers given in part to this question. But can I start with Grand Chief Bosom? Just how can we do better as regulators with these projects to see us get across the finish line sooner?
Well, I think one is that there needs to be a process to where the information gets to the people that will be impacted. We have established what we call pre-exploration agreements, and this is really they're non-binding, but it allows people to understand the project, input into the project, and build trust, with the industry, and so. And then it's a lot easier as you go along. You gain partnership as you do it.
Yeah, I think that's we've come a long way with certain companies in Canada too. It used to be, First Nations weren't consulted until halfway through the process, and to me, it's come a long ways. Again, it depends on the company, but starting off right from the start, having those conversations with Indigenous communities that are going to be affected right from the very start of those negotiations. And I've seen ones that do that have just mutual respect for each other and success as a result. I just wanted to talk to Mr. Coates and Mr. Stewart about sort of the same question, but we were talking earlier about this. You know, we previously, in about 2011, 2015, we had a pretty solid approval process, or a process that projects would go through, and they had a 24-month period of timeline to get from start to finish. It was better for certainty, it was better for investment, it was better for everybody around. But we have slipped from that timeline quite a bit. My simple question to you is, where is Canada in the approval process for projects globally? Certainly Canada is not the only country that has resources, but where do we stack up in terms of that timeline? And Mr. Coates, you referred to this first in your statement, so maybe I'll ask you. Go ahead.
Sure, I'll give you a brief answer. There are some countries that have almost no regulations and controls. In fact, they allow a sort of almost a free market kind of an approach. And so the companies themselves put the limits. And in fact, Canadian companies are very good at this. They sort of notionally apply sort of a Canadian standard to their activities and operations. But that's not the government that's imposing those. It's the mining companies doing it. There are places like Scandinavia that's actually reintroducing their mining sector, and they're actually coming to Canada to say, how are we doing? Australia is a lot faster. Russia is a lot faster. Not a bad example. Mongolia, China, these countries are faster. They're not role models. My point would be is that we can do an awful lot better. We can basically do, Mr. Zimmer, by starting where you mentioned that let people know how much it costs for these delays to occur, and let them know how many mines, how many projects sort of disappear because, in fact, mining company looks at it and says, "Gosh, this is too risky for the kind of time frame that we have involved."
Right. Well, Mr. Coates, you talked about it as well, that a more lengthy process isn't necessarily a better one. We've seen this. It's been part of the project history where I'm from, where these projects sometimes go through a 10-year process, and finally, by that particular time, the project is no longer even viable. So maybe can you just explain a little bit what you meant? Because I believe that probably many on this meeting today, that the world needs more Canada, not less. Certainly we have the best environmental standards, best human rights standards in the world. And again, we need to develop our resources here, not only develop them, but value add and do as many parts of that process in Canada as we can before we export that product. But maybe, Mr. Coates, can you just explain that a lengthy process isn't necessarily a better one, that statement that you made earlier?
Yeah, I mean,
I can give you about 30 seconds to answer that.
Okay. Go fast, be solid, focus on outcomes. Don't focus on sort of the decision-making process. Trust Aboriginal folks. The Aboriginal folks live on their territories and in their land. They will look after it better than any regulatory process will ever do.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
You went fast. Thank you. Mr. Lefebvre, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing with us today. Mr. Coates, just interesting comments you made about how we should proceed on, certainly when we talk about assessments and talk about regional assessments. And I know that's what our one of the things our government has brought forward. Actually, one of the initial ones is actually in the Ring of Fire in northwestern Ontario, where there is a regional assessment being done right now by ECCC to make sure that the baselines are there. So your suggestion is something that is obviously has been heard many, many times by the departments federally, and it's certainly something way to move forward. And I know Minister Zimmer talked about certainly how do we get Indigenous participation up front, not at the tail end, and I fully agree with him. That is the way. So any successful project, that's what they've done, and that's what we've also tried to integrate in the impact assessment, right? The new review process. And I don't want to get into a debate as to SIA 2012 and the new impact assessment, and as you said, it's early days, but because we're here to talk about critical minerals, and certainly, although this is part of it, certainly, I'd like to maybe chat with Mr. Stewart. With respect to Rio Tinto is an international company. It's a very large company. And the purpose of the discussion here is how do we ensure that the supply chain of our minerals and metals is secured in Canada, and how do we go about maximizing it, right? Getting all the value added that we can do it in Canada. But obviously, as an international company, that's not really your focus. Your focus is obviously getting the best value for your efforts, right? So can you give us a sense of what's going on in Australia and maybe other jurisdictions that you can share with that they're having these discussions? Because this discussion is just not in Canada right now. It's all over the world. We want to protect certainly all of these minerals and metals as much as we can to ensure in our renewable industry and obviously in our battery industry that we are all, as we electrify our world, this is so critical. So can you give us a bit of insights of what's going on elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you said, there's activity everywhere, right? I think there's quite a big rare earths play in Australia at the moment. Also, there's been a lot of interest in lithium there as well. But I think when you look around the world, it's the world's geological deposits aren't evenly distributed. Okay, so we go to the countries where the minerals are, and every country has its comparative advantages because of that. But when I look at sort of Canada, Canada I think has some sort of unique advantages when you sort of think about the future. We are finding a lot of these critical minerals within our ore bodies that we're exploiting already. So I think it's continuing with that type of work, as I've explained. But also when we start to think about like steel making for the future, for example, and a zero carbon steel making process. This is something that's of big interest to us as a company because we provide a lot of iron ore. And one of the best iron ore deposits that's best suited to those sort of future steelmaking technologies exists in Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador, at our Iron Ore of Canada. Yep. So you can see that there are these sort of relative comparative advantages. So and they're geological in nature.
And we've heard that from many witnesses, and I think what it boils down to, I think, and we have unanimous consent here. Well, I think with respect to how do we make sure that critical mineral processing and manufacturing capacity is increased in Canada, right? So, and that certainly we don't like it when we see certainly some of our minerals or certainly of our natural resources exported elsewhere and then manufactured elsewhere. And how can we again increase that supply chain? And I'd like maybe from your lens, what can we do, or what should we do to ensure that the processing, which we have some, obviously, I'm the MP from Sudbury, so we have two smelters in my writing, in my writing, right, which is kind of rare, but as well as the whole manufacturing, or all the upstream stuff. What are your thoughts?
The key thing is it's especially with the critical minerals, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of price volatility because these are kind of new industries. We see the same thing with lithium, a lot of price volatility in lithium. And the only way you can assure sort of production in a country or at a particular mine site is to make sure that you have the ability to absorb all of those fluctuations in price. So in other words, it means being a low-cost producer. So where you can be a low-cost producer in a country, in a commodity that has quite a volatile sort of pricing, then due to these sort of oversupply issues as demand grows, then you'll be a player in the long term. So really the key thing in the mining industry is if you're going to enter a particular market, and particular market that will be volatile as it starts up, which is what we're talking about with these critical minerals in all of these new applications for a low carbon future, you're going to need to make sure that you're really at the bottom of the cost curve.
Thanks, Mr. Stewart. And thanks, Mr. Lefebvre. Thank you. Okay, over to back to Mr. Simard for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to follow along the same lines as my friend. I have a further question for you, Mr. Stewart. You said earlier that we can't do secondary or tertiary processing here because it's being absorbed by the United States capacity. Well, they have the same ecosystem as we do, and if we don't get onto it, it won't get done in Canada. as a major corporation, I think you do have a responsibility. I'm interested in aluminum, of course, and critical minerals. And as an MP, my concern is job creation in my riding, in my area. I feel a little bit unsettled when I have to make announcements, and it's not going to be in my region. What can Rio Tinto do, or what will they do to ensure that these clusters, whether it's in aluminum or critical minerals, now, you have all sorts of activities going on, but what can you do to maximize them? Well, we have made a major investment, $67 million approximately. We're proposing another project also at Lac Saint-Jean. I'm not sure that it's going to result in any loss of employment, any reduction in employment, but we're creating something new here. We're going to have to create a new ceramic alloy for high technology, very high advanced technology. It's a completely different technology or process, and we have the future ahead of us for that. For rare earth elements, REE, I would say that they're used in very complex applications, but those people needing them are already our clients. And very often, they're found in the States, once again, but this is a truism everywhere. I mean, we still encourage the manufacture of this material or these applications, the high technology, modern technology. Most of our clients are in the United States, so the jobs follow. Oh, thank you.
Mr. Cannings, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, and I think I will continue with Mr. Stewart. Unlike Mr. Lefebvre, I only have one big smelter in my riding, and that's the Teck smelter at Trail, big lead zinc smelter, and it does produce some rare elements in the same way that you were mentioning, Mr. Stewart. I think it's mainly germanium and indium that they produce. They're one of the world's top producers of that. And again, small amounts, but very important, very valuable commodities. I guess what I'd like to ask you, Rio Tinto, it's a big worldwide company, one of the biggest. Just wonder if you have any examples elsewhere in the world that Canada could follow, or how does Canada's strategy around, critical minerals, critical metals compare with, say, Australia's strategy? What could the federal government be doing to increase or make it easier for us to find these materials, and also to create those value chains as you seem to be doing with scandium in Quebec?
I think from our perspective, there was a conversation sort of earlier on about permitting and getting projects going. I think at the very beginning, what we're finding is actually Canada is very good, relative to other parts of the world. And I think what's particularly important is in speed. It's not so much the structure of the legislation; it's more which Canada is actually very good and very thorough. It is about building trust with all of the stakeholders involved and moving quickly there. And I think it is through building that trust, working collectively together, particularly with First Nations in the case of Canada, is very, very critical. It's all about trust. It's the trust that actually builds the speed, because it's when we failures of trust that you have to go back and redo things, and that forms the delays. I also think one of the useful things in Canada that it has is which is pretty unique, and we applied it in our Diavik mine, is that the operating permit right from the very beginning not only looked at the development of the mine itself to get it operating, but also had to include what the plans were for the closure at the end. So we're looking at the environment in a holistic way. And I think that's the other unique thing that we see in Canada. In terms of encouraging the industry. I think really what it comes down to is the quality of the ore bodies, and that means good exploration. And Canada's very open to exploration. We find Canada to be very open, very good when it comes to exploration. We have many ongoing exploration activities in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I'm going to have to interrupt you again. You can't say I didn't warn you at the beginning that I'd be doing this a lot, so I apologize. Thanks, Mr. Cannings. Mr. Patzer, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'll start with Mr. Stewart as well. So yeah, again, looking at the underdevelopment of critical minerals in Canada, in your opinion, how long will it take for us to have everything in place for developing our own battery industry?
Well, I'm really not a battery expert, so or a manufacturer of batteries, so I really couldn't can say.
As far as like the development of the minerals that are required, though, right? I mean, we're talking about the critical minerals, right? I mean, so how long is it going to take to have the production in place specifically for these critical minerals? How much of it currently exists? Like, where are we at in that framework?
Well, there's very little in the lithium space at the moment, but a lot of talk about many projects in Quebec and in Alberta. Phosphorus and phosphate mining is also a very, very interesting area as well, because a lot of the batteries are lithium-ion phosphate, and they're thermally a lot more stable. So the phosphate side of the business is very good, an interesting area.
As far as
we just need to get these projects going, right? And I think one of the key things that I mentioned earlier about being successful in the mining industry is finding an ore body that's large and has a low cost to exploit. Because as these markets take off, because they're new, they're very, very volatile. So to withstand those ups and downs in price volatility, you need to make sure that you're on the low end of the cost curve. So having an ore body with a low strip ratio that's near the surface, that requires relatively low cost processing to extract, and it's a large ore body that will last you for a long time. Those are the key elements of mining.
Okay. And so partly why I'm wondering with around the timelines here is there appears to be a 3-year window within the new CUSMA deal to source about 75% of lithium regionally before tariffs will be hit. Are we at risk of missing that window to get that production here in Canada?
I think the way we see it, lithium is definitely going to be required in the longer term. So lithium's around to stay. So it's about building something for the long term, which means, as I mentioned, about the large ore bodies, the low cost ore bodies. Those are the things that Canada should be focusing on.
Yeah. Will we have those mines though? I mean, again, that capacity that we need, 75% regionally, are we going to be able to hit that in 2 or 3 years, or are we kind of going to be caught up in a regulatory limbo here that's going to cause us to miss that 3-year window that's set out by the CUSMA deal?
2 to 3 years is a short time to bring a mine on stream with all of its processing plants and facilities, which you'll need for something like lithium.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Coates, I got a few questions for you. You recently co-wrote an article with Stephen Buffalo, president of the Indian Resource Council, stating that the Liberal government's approach for a green economy, and I'll quote, could undo one of the most important examples of Indigenous engagement. So is it fair to say that the government pushes a false dichotomy between developing clean technology and fossil fuels?
Boy, you asked me a sensitive question, sir. Let me put it this way, and the main point in that article, Indigenous folks were on the outside looking in on resource development for 150 years. And in fact, devastating results followed. Some of the situations were horrible in mines that were developed on Indigenous territories. Over the last 15 years, through duty to consult and accommodate legislation and treaty rights and things of that sort, Indigenous folks have emerged as a major part of the natural resource economy. And you get a situation in Canada right now where we're seeing these things in sort of very stark terms. And I think they're wrong terms about saying, well, resource development is bad. We're going to have some new economy that's good. Well, the new economy requires resource development. You know in this committee that that's absolutely central. But for goodness sake, this is my strongest sort of observation. is that Indigenous people are active and enthusiastic participants in carefully done resource development. They want to be part of the process. They're desperate for own source revenues. They want the jobs. They want the commercial opportunity, and they want to protect the environment. We must be really careful to protect that and not run. And I think the oil and gas industry, we've sort of moved offline. The Indigenous involvement in the oil and gas industry has been spectacular over the last 10 to 15 years. And now it's going to come at risk because the country as a whole is underestimating the long-term economic value of oil and gas. So let's make sure we listen to Indigenous people, and not just those Indigenous people who favor a very strong environmentalist agenda.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Patzer. Right on time.
Thank you.
So Mr. Sidhu, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. Today being International Women's Day, we continue to push for gender equality and celebrate the achievements and successes of so many women. Mr. Stewart, there are very few women working in the mining sector, and one of the goals under the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan is to have a workplace consisting of at least 30% women, hopefully more in the mining sector by 2030, including Indigenous women. How many women currently work for Rio Tinto as laborers and in management positions, and what is your plan to hire more?
This is a very, very important question for us. When I think when we talk to the main workforce, I'm not sure of the actual figures, so I apologize for that. But this is something we're very actively involved with in building, encouraging, and keeping women and anyone, from a diverse background in the company, making them feel included and respected every day. So we've just actually created an officer position to do this, and also we're setting the tone right from the very top. If you look at the recent announcements that we've made, we've got a new CEO and the executive committee of the company. You'll see that we have, I'm pretty sure of it, if I just do the maths, over 30% of the participants in the EXCO, the executive committee of the company, are now women. And we've also introduced more women at the board level of the company as well. So this is something that we're passionate about as a company, about inclusion and diversity, and something we're strongly engaged towards changing.
Thank you for that, and that's very promising to hear. I know our government will be nice to see your company part of that challenge as well. You mentioned that you guys are the largest mining operation in your opening remarks across Canada and second largest in the world. What's important to me is I know you operate over a few provinces across the country, and I want to know about your relationships. What are they like with the local Indigenous populations, and how could they be better?
Well, I think you're always best asking the First Nations peoples of their opinion, their opinions of this. But we strive to be sort of trusted, to work collaboratively with the First Nations people across the country. We've signed many agreements across the country in the last 2 years, working with First Nations people in all of the territories in which we operate. And we see them as being, incredibly important partners in the work that we do. We strive to have, and continuing to improve our ESG credentials, and work in a very, very respectful way, not only with the First Nations people, but with all of our stakeholders in the communities in which we operate.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. And my colleague had touched earlier on the demand for scandium, and in your opening remarks, you spoke about producing scandium in Sorel-Tracy, Quebec. Could you explain to this committee why you decided to extract this metal? What is the potential uses? You briefly touched on that, but I'd like to know more about that. And also, would you consider this a critical mineral? Why or why
not? Well, first, yes, it is a critical mineral. Scandium is a rare earth, one of the 22 rare earth elements. And the reason we were looking into it is we were, going through that sort of creative process of seeing what else that we could do to meet this sort of critical minerals challenge. And And there are two big applications for scandium in the world, and one of the largest is actually for fuel cells. It's an alloying element for the main ceramic that's used as a solid oxide electrolyte in fuel cells. So this is all part of the green economy. That's the biggest use at the moment. And then the second is in aluminium. And the key with aluminium, it helps actually sort of lighten structures. So again, less energy required to move those structures, and like cars. And the issue was that scandium was very expensive, and there wasn't a stability of supply. So a lot of people wouldn't get into the manufacture of aluminium scandium type alloys because there was an uncertainty about the stability of supply, the long-term stability of supply, which is particularly important if you're a car company or you're dealing with something in defense. So what we do is we actually sort of bring that stability of supply now.
Thank you. Right on time, Mr. Sidhu. Perfect. I didn't have to interrupt you there. I feel much better myself. Mr. McLean, over to you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And the first question I'm going to go to is Mr. Stewart here. Mr. Stewart, can you give us a little bit of a brief on when these mines are profitable for your company and what you do when the commodity price makes their future tenability unprofitable and therefore undevelopable?
Well, really, we don't invest in mines unless we know that we have a mine which is a long life and a low cost, and that position in the first quartile of the cost curve. That's absolutely key, because we won't invest if we don't have that, because we know fundamentally that it wouldn't survive during any trough in commodity prices. So that's one of the key things that we always need to do. And if we work that way, we can actually sort of plan a lot better for the full life cycle of the mine, from its sort of creation right through to its sort of closure. So that's what we always strive to do as a mining company, is to work that way.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, the world market right now is cornered in rare earths by the Chinese government-owned entities, and they generally act as a cartel. So in the mines they own, when foreign mines seem to come on and be taking market share, they usually flood the market with theirs. And does that affect your development at all?
It makes us wary, for sure, of investing in a brand new mine that, say, would produce rare earths because of that sort of level of volatility. And this is why we've looked at being creative and looked at what rare earths actually sit within our ore bodies today and whether we can extract them already. Because fundamentally, the main metal or mineral that we're extracting in our mines today is what keeps the mine going and surviving, and it has that sort of low cost position. So basically, we're creating the extraction of these additional rare earths within a fundamentally stable business, and that's the way we can guard against that. But I think you raise a really interesting point: is there something that governments can actually do to create a stability of price and a stability of demand, given that these critical minerals are so critical for countries? So, for example, Canada, the US, and Australia are all working together in the critical mineral space to try and create that sort of geopolitical stability, really, in supply and indigenous supply of critical minerals. So, is there something that governments can do to actually create that stability and that would encourage and favour more indigenous production of these critical minerals going forward?
Well, thank you. And you also mentioned, one last question for you, Mr. Stewart. You talk about the environment in a holistic way. And the cost of obviously the development, once these elements become more rare, once they're mined a little bit, is going to obviously change the dynamics of battery production to the point where the environment and the CO2 emissions involved in mining these elements is going to be greater perhaps than the CO2 it replaces in the transportation chain, if you will. Any comments on that?
Well, I think what we have to do as society is find ways to extract minerals with a zero carbon footprint going forward. So there's not a lot of point in creating a lot of emissions, a lot of CO2 to save something elsewhere. We've got to do both together. So the commitment that we're taking as a company in Rio Tinto is to stay in line with our commitment to reduce our emissions by 2030 in line with the Paris Agreement, and also to be net zero in 2050. And that is going to require an awful lot of innovation. And we will need to partner with people outside of our company because we don't have the ability to do all of that.
Okay. One question here for Grand Chief Bosom. Grand Chief, can you tell us about the actual setbacks you see right now as far as developments of resources and involvement of the Indigenous community in your experience?
In our area, I think what's really lacking is the infrastructure. We see that the infrastructure, the roads tend to, or the mining companies, mining exploration operations tend to follow the roads. And some of the roads, of course, could lead right into the heart of areas that are culturally sensitive. And so our objective right now is to work with the government to design, the infrastructure network dealing with transportation, communications, and electrification. And I think if we could do that, then at least our people will know where mining will be taking place. And that I think provides stability and predictability.
Thank you, Grand Chief. And I have one final question, Doug. Mr. Chair.
Unfortunately,
okay.
Mr. McLean,
thank you.
You're over time a bit, but we will have time to get back to you or your colleagues, so don't worry. And next is Mr. May for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here. And one of the challenges with going a little later in the order here is a lot of the questions that I had have been answered. So I wanted to kind of maybe circle back on a couple of things to maybe give the witnesses a few more moments to elaborate on some of the things that maybe they got cut off by our fantastic chair a little bit too early. And I just, sorry, Mr. Chair, no offense. I just wanted to maybe start with Grand Chief Bosom. You had mentioned in your opening remarks, you talked about being the battery of the North, and I wanted to continue a little bit with that theme, and MP McLean just talked a little bit about some of the things that's, what's stopping this from happening. What are some of the challenges? And so, just really boiling down, what is your greatest headache with this? Like, what are the biggest challenges right now that you have it's getting in the way of this?
I would say the unknown, industry, or I should say that our experience has been resource development has come at our doorstep sort of at the last minute. And so we're unprepared. And so at the end of the day, we don't necessarily pick up, I guess, all the benefits that we could. And that's why we want to change the approach, where we want to plan out the 30-year work together with the government to develop a 30-year infrastructure plan. And so that, our people would know exactly, what's likely to happen. I mean, we see the maps, we see the geology, we see all these exploration. We got over 300 exploration territory, and but we don't know when a project is going to happen. And even these lithium mines, there's 5 of them, and you ask all of them the question of how you're going to transport the material out, and they have 5 different answers. So there's no coordination, as we see in transportation, and that creates concerns and confusion. So if we can plan better, have a better plan together, I think that includes First Nations people, then we'll see more projects and projects where benefits will be shared.
In addition to extracting and shipping the materials, we've heard a lot today about the need to be processed before going into finished products like electronics and batteries. Do you believe that your band have the process capacity, or would you be able to provide that capacity in the medium or long term? And how do you see, like you talk about not being prepared? Is that something that if given support, you think that could exist?
Definitely, I think we're the population that'll stay, that's here, and that'll stay even after the mine is closed. So it's in our interest to see not only the short-term impact, but the long-term impact. And we also have the need as well to create our economies and create jobs. And so if we knew ahead of time and work together ahead of to plan better, then of course we can put in place the training programs necessary, or encourage our students to pursue professional careers, and so we see that the future can be bright if we can start working together.
And quickly, Mr. Stewart, if that were to happen, if we were to see those resources being put into place to create some added value chain and sort of controlling the supply chain a little bit, do you see that having an impact on that volatility you talked about with regard to pricing?
I think the more sort of manufacturing and demand and use within Canada for some of these products would be a great help to sort of reducing the the volatility in pricing. And I think as the markets mature and then becomes more of a manufacturing base in Canada, that will help.
Excellent.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. May.
Thank you very much.
Okay, who do we have next? Mr. Simard, back to you, sir, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Rapidement, j'ai mis en avis trois motions il y a déjà 2 semaines.
Okay, well, hang on. The interpreter was on the wrong channel there, so go ahead. I had proposed 3 motions a few weeks ago. I'd like to come back to those motions. They've already been discussed at the liaison committee. The first are on translated documents, that all the documents presented in the scope of the work of the committee that don't come from the federal government be examined by the Translation Bureau and revised before being distributed to the members. I think the objective is fair, clear.
De la traduction.
Sorry, the interpretation's not working again.
The 3 motions were tabled together and all deal with the translation of documents.
Oui. Voilà, donc je vous ai fait lecture de la première.
Okay, I'll read you the first one then. The one on the documents that are being translated or received untranslated. Can I read the second one? On the technical test, you have the interpretation now, do you not? Oh. My second motion, that the clerk advise witnesses to appear that technical tests should be conducted in order to check the connectivity and the equipment used to ensure the best possible sound quality, and that the chair advises the committee at the start of each meeting of any witness who did not perform a required technical test. So I believe that this motion has been accepted in all other committees where it was presented. My third motion, which on substantive motions, that the text
You've
Okay, parfait.
And I may be wrong
Perfect.
because the translation wasn't working perfectly, but I think you've read the text of 2 motions. I would ask that you pick one, let's
Oui.
deal with it, and then move on. So which motion would you like to deal with first?
On peut commencer par la première.
I'd like to begin with the first one, please. Those documents that are translated by the Translation Bureau.
And Mr. Simard, perhaps you can just verify this is the right motion. It says that all documents submitted for committee business that do
Que tout document présenté dans le cadre des travaux du comité ne provenant pas du ministère fédéral qui soit envoyé au bureau de traduction préalablement soumis à une révision linguistique par le bureau et ainsi de suite. Yes, that's the correct motion. Thank you.
this motion. Mr. May, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do have something to add to this debate, but I am wondering if, with your permission, Mr. Chair, this may take a bit, and we have about 20 minutes left before the committee wraps up here. Do we think we'll be getting back to witnesses, or should we maybe thank them for their time and allow them to be dismissed at this point?
Yeah, I was going to get to that, Mr. May. The answer to that question depends entirely on how many hands go up and how long people choose to talk. And I don't have a crystal ball to determine that right now. But for the witnesses, we do have about 25 minutes left in the meeting. Just so you're aware, what's happening right now is Mr. Simard has, and he's within his rights to do so, introduced a motion to the committee for consideration, which we will do right now, which means we're going to delay further questions to you. And to Mr. May's point, I don't know how long that delay is going to take place, so I don't know if we'll get back to you or not. So if I could just ask you to, for a few minutes anyway, just bear with us and patiently watch us discuss this. So, Mr. May, was that your only submission, or did you have other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to further comment and just to clarify which motion that we're talking about here. This is the motion regarding translation, the Translation Bureau specifically, and my question. And first of all, I want to thank Mr. Simard for bringing these forward. I as a chair myself, I think it's incredibly important that we have hold ourselves at an incredibly high standard when it comes to documents and motions in terms of being able to be understood in both official languages. I think that it's a very important part of this process, and we need to make sure that if there are ways to improve, that we make those changes. That being said, I do have a question maybe that the clerks and the analysts can weigh in on in terms of whether this is being done right now. And I know that many offices, not just within members of parliament, but also the analysts and the clerks have the ability to translate documents themselves. And I'm wondering if this motion would stop that ability to happen. In other words, create a really big logjam at the Translation Bureau, which we know we've all had to send documents over to be translated, and there's delays in that. And a lot of us have the ability, a lot of MPs and the folks that help us through these, whether it's a clerk or the analyst, they do a lot of their own translation. This motion, the way it's written right now, to me, would suggest that can't happen anymore. And I would argue that is an unintended consequence would be an unintended consequence of this motion. And I'm wondering if Mr. Simard could maybe comment to that, and maybe the analysts or the clerk could maybe comment to that as well.
Why don't we do this? We have a speaking list. If the clerk or analysts have a response to that, why don't we hear from them now, and then I can move to Mr. Lloyd, and then I'll move to Mr. Simard.
Si je peux intervenir, Monsieur le Président. Alors, moi, je dirais que tous nos documents sont traduits.
Mr. Chair, I could say that all of our documents are translated by professional translators from the Translation Bureau. So no, there won't be an impact on us. Our briefing notes, for example, are translated by the Bureau, and this is what we give the committee.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to Mr. Lloyd then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and largely agree with my colleague, Mr. May's intervention on this, but to basically condense it and cut it short, other committees have accepted an amendment, which I will move right now, that we also add, so after the word federal department, we also add members' offices. So this is an amendment so that if members' offices do provide things that they translate, that it will also be reflected. So this has been accepted by other committees, so I just move this amendment.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, so it would say, do not come from a federal department or members' offices?
Yes, so it would be from a federal department, comma, members' offices, comma, or that have not been translated by the Translation Bureau.
Okay, all right, perfect, thank you. Okay, so do you have anything else to add to that, Mr. Lloyd, or you're done?
Well, I guess we would have debate on this amendment, and then we'd have a vote on
this
that.
amendment. I just wanted to make sure you were finished making your submission on the amendment, that's all. Okay, so if you guys don't mind taking your hands down when you're finished making your point, it's easier for me, thank you. Okay, so the next person to speak is Mr. Simard, but we're now discussing Mr. Lloyd's amendment. So Mr. Simard, it's appropriate we move to you next, actually.
Oui, je pense que...
Yes, thank you, Chair. I concur completely with this amendment that's been added in other committees as well. I have no worries about that at all.
Mr. Lefebvre and then Mr. May, I believe.
Okay, merci, Monsieur le Président. Moi aussi,
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any problem with the amendment proposed by Mr. Lloyd. And the analyst, did I understand you correctly? It's already been the practice. Is it not a standard practice, or is it brand new? I don't think it's brand new. I think that probably been done in the past. Yes, I do confirm that. It is our current practice. Well, I see absolutely no problem with the motion or the amendment either.
Okay, Mr. May, over to you on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My hand is up for the greater debate, so I would suggest that you move on from me and maybe come back to me after we've dealt with the amendment.
Okay, is there anybody else have any comments, questions, or input on Mr. Lloyd's amendment? I see none. Okay, so Madam Clerk, can we then vote on the amendment?
A point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Lloyd, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, I haven't heard anyone say anything against the amendment, so I'm wondering if we could just pass the amendment. I believe it's passing on division without having to have a roll call.
Okay, that's Madam Clerk. Can we proceed that way?
I believe we can, yes.
Okay. All right. So, sorry?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good. Okay, so no need for recorded votes. So the amendment is passed on division, Mr. Lloyd? So let's go back to our discussion on the motion now as amended. So Mr. May, you are next, and then Mr. Simard.
Thank you. My next concern with this is actually been just demonstrated. So we just had a substantive amendment, friendly, and it was friendly and it was agreed upon. The way that the way that I'm reading this, and maybe Mr. Simard can correct me if this isn't the intention, but that no longer would be possible. We would have to stop. Mr. Lloyd would have to submit his motion, somehow be translated quickly, and normally we are able to do that through through translation that is provided on these calls. I just want to be very clear that again, we're not seeing an unintended consequence here, and all of a sudden the committee's grinding to a halt every time we have a motion. Motions, of course, are part of our privilege as members, and I'm just concerned that if there's a motion, a substantive motion based on something that is being discussed in that particular meeting, we as members have the right to move that motion in real time. There is no 48-hour rule in that regard, and I'm a little concerned that this would butt up against the rules of the House, which of course we follow here in committee. And if I'm misinterpreting this, please forgive me. But that's when I read this, that was one of the things that jumped out at me as a concern. So I don't know how we could word it to allow for motions coming from the floor and then can be interpreted through translation services that we have on these calls, which has been the practice moving forward, or up till now, I should say.
Mr. May, is it possible your comments are more aptly directed to the other motion that
I may very well. Sorry, am I getting ahead of myself? I'm sorry.
You're ahead of us all as usual. So.
My apologies.
Okay, so we'll leave that there. So I've got Mr. Simard.
Voilà.
And I gather Mr. Lefebvre was going to make the same point.
Merci. C'est ce que j'allais.
Yes, that's what I was going to indicate to my colleague. His comments, I think, is on the substantive motion, the one containing substantive motion. Even if it is a practice to translate the documents which are not from a department, it's not mandatory. This makes it obligatory. There are some times at the Heritage Committee, what we'd received by way of wording or copy were quite different from the initial formulation. So what we want to do here is to ensure for the Francophone as well as for the Anglophone that the meaning of the documents be respected, and so that we can all be on the same frequency as to what the intent and the wording of the motion is. That's it.
Further comments on the motion as amended? Okay, so let's deal with this motion as amended then. Do we need a recorded vote? No? Okay. So Madam Clerk, the motion then we can deem as passed as amended. Thank you, Mr. Simard. Can we move on back to our witnesses?
Il y a la deuxième motion.
Well, I have a second motion on the technical sound checks for the witnesses. And shall I read it?
Go for the day, Mr. Simard. I don't want them to take up any of their time unnecessarily if we're not going to. So it doesn't look like we're going to get back to them. So you have this motion and one more, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. All right. Just one moment then, Mr. Simard. Okay, to our witnesses, let me just say thank you on behalf of all of the committee. One of our colleagues said earlier this was a very interesting discussion, very informative, and I apologize for time's cut short a bit, but sometimes we need to deal with matters that prevent us from finishing the meeting and finishing the rounds of questions. But we are very grateful. I just want to say thank you again and appreciate you taking the time to join us. And we're going to carry on with the rest of our business at this meeting, but you're free to go. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay,
Donc,
Mr. Simard, back to you.
Rapidement, est-ce que je vous fais lecture de...
So shall I read the second motion on the technical test, audio test?
And which is the second and which is the third motion? Yeah.
Okay. Wait.
Quite right, Mr. Chair. The clerk inform each witness who is to appear before the committee that the House of Administration support team conduct technical tests to check the connectivity and to adjust and to the equipment and to ensure the best possible sound quality, and that the chair advises the committee at the start of each meeting of any witness who did not perform the required technical test. This motion has also been adopted in a number of other committees where it was presented.
Thank you. Mr. May?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just simply to say, I believe this is in fact the practice, and to simply formalize it, I think we'd be in favor of.
Yeah, it's the practice as I understand it too. So, Mr. Lloyd?
Yeah, I think you'll find no trouble with us on this one, and I'd just move that we move to a vote.
Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's do that. Madam Clerk, do we need a recorded vote on this one, anybody? No? Okay, so motion approved. Mr. Simard, I think that brings us back to you for now we know what the third motion is.
Yes, now we figured that out. The one on the text of any substantive motion or any motion in amendment of a substantive motion. So that, the text of any substantive motion or any motion to amendment of a substantive motion be distributed in writing in both official languages to all committee members before the committee begins debate on such a motion.
May, you have your hand up. I have a hunch I know what you're going to say.
Thank you, Mr. Yeah, I kind of trumped myself a little bit there in terms of this one. And again, I think that I have to reiterate that it's a priority of all of us. I hope it's a priority of all of us to ensure that we can all be understood, and we want to strengthen our ability to be understood at all times. Where this runs in, I run into an issue with this particular motion is, again, the nature of committees is often on the fly, right? And there's amendments to substantive motions that happen during these conversations, during these debates. I can only imagine what it would be like to follow this while doing a report where there's amendments upon amendments, and based on how certain things are amended, there could be additional amendments. I'd just be very concerned that if this is adopted as is, we'd be really grinding to a halt and also potentially breaching privilege. So I'm open to a discussion on this one, if it can be amended in some way or clarified, and maybe Mr. Simard could speak to maybe my misinterpretation of what is being said. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have to echo Mr. May's comments, but to add something novel, even if we were to amend something on this, if this were to be passed, we wouldn't be able to amend anything on the fly. So, and I also think it does, potentially infringe on our parliamentary privilege. And so I would just say that generally, unless Mr. Simard has some sort of substantive amendment to his own motion that can address these issues, for example, as well, because you have to present the amendment before the committee even begins translated, that would negate any ability for the committee to deal with this in real time. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Simard.
Il faut revenir à la...
Well, we have to come back to the definition of a substantive motion. I think that's what's at issue here. A substantive motion, as it's worded here, does not prohibit the presentation ad lib of an amendment of a motion. And it doesn't really limit the scope of any amendments when we're dealing with a clause-by-clause discussion. Before voting, each member of Parliament has to be in a position to have a reasoned consent, informed consent, and know what he's going to be voting on. So it comes a little bit difficult when a substantive motion. So I would draw your attention to the definition of a substantive motion. The definition that I find, there's no limitation on introducing an amendment on the fly, ad lib, as it were. Thank you.
Mr. Simard, I think where the concern is, everybody agrees with the spirit of your motion. Everybody agrees that translation is essential, whether it's from French to English or English to French. What the concern is, and I share it, frankly, is that the way this is worded is if this motion were passed and Mr. Lloyd or Mr. May, for example, wanted to make an amendment to this motion, they couldn't because we'd have to stop and have it translated by translation services. So they're not, nobody's opposed to the spirit of the motion. It's a technical glitch, I think, is what we're really talking about. But Mr. Lloyd, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, and something, Mr. Simard, that was confusing is when you're saying, well, this only really applies to substantive motions, and I would say that it is required that a substantive motion does require 48 hours in advance. So with translation, so that should be ample enough protection for your concerns about informed consent, and so I would say that maybe this this motion of yours has already been really dealt with, and so not sure if there's any more discussion on this, but I'd be happy. Do you think we need to vote on this, or Mr. Simard, what do you think?
Well, simplement.
Well, in that case, if the obligation is there to table it 48 hours prior, well, I can't vote against that, but I don't see why this would cause any problem.
Perhaps we can hear. Sorry, Mr. May, I didn't see your hand up there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to clarify, and I agree with MP Lloyd, but just to clarify, you don't need to give 48 hours notice as per the rules of the House, as long as this is the motion is germane to the topic that you're discussing. And again, this would be a breach of privilege. You would be taking away a member's privilege to move a motion based on the debate that we're seeing in front of us. And I think that is a dangerous precedent. And I don't think that's what's intended. I really don't. I think that the intent of this motion is to ensure that we are understood and respect the bilingual nature of this country. But in doing so, you wouldn't be able to hear something in a committee, for example, and be able to move a motion based on that, which of course we have that privilege right now. So that would be, I won't be voting in favor of this on that grounds, unless it's moved, because the actual motion, from what I understand, is it doesn't just say substantive motions. It says that the text of any substantive motion or any motion in amendment of that substantive motion. So you would have to know, even before we debate these issues, what your amendment would be, or what the.
Alors, tout dépendant de votre perspective là-dessus, ceci laisse de côté l'objectif même du débat.
Thanks, Mr. May. Mr. Simard, perhaps we could hear from the clerk. I think what we're talking about, we all agree, is that we're talking about amendments on the fly during the course of a debate on a motion. And Mr. May's point, Mr. Lloyd's point, and concern I share is that it would be a breach of our privilege if you have to stop and you can't amend a motion during the course of a meeting. So perhaps it might be helpful if the clerk could just confirm that in fact is the correct interpretation, and then I will give what appears to be the last word to Mr. Simard.
Yes, what Mr. May has recently outlined, that is in fact correct. Committee members can move substantive motions without notice if that is the topic at hand. The committee would need to decide if what Mr. Simard is proposing goes against that or not.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Simard.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'd also feel that it's a breach of privilege to try to debate a motion that I don't understand because it's not translated into my language. So I think that is another breach of privilege. How can someone decide on a motion if he hasn't really captured the essence of it? The text that you have before you, I think, would seal off this breach, if you will. Often for a francophone, when it's a not untranslated motion, it's very, very difficult. It would be the same if something was tabled only in French. It would be very difficult to decide on the actual ground of the motion.
Mr. Simard, again, I don't think anybody disagrees with anything you just said. It's the technical requirement to have it in writing and go through translation services before it can be considered by the committee. And that prevents amendments being put forward during the course of a meeting, during the course of a debate. And that's the challenge we face. So nobody disagrees with you, but the amendment would result in a a technical breach resulting in a violation of members' privilege. Mr. Lefebvre,
Mr. Chair. Puis à ce sujet, M. Simard, juste que c'est là.
This is where the role of the interpreters might turn out to be quite interesting and vital, because it has been the practice. If it's, and very often, if there's an amendment following an amendment following an amendment, we have to, if we were to insist on having it all in writing, it would be a complete gridlock. Would make the thing impossible. I understand your point absolutely, 100%, but this is where we have to rely on the expertise of our interpreters to get us through. Yes, I agree, and I'll close on this note. We've had situations where the interpretation was not available, and we would have to vote on decisions taken in the committee, at the committee, and they're voting blindly in that case. In the context that we're in today, with the pandemic going on, certain of our technical tools sometimes break down. And I think there could be a loss here, the thin edge of the wedge for a breach of privilege in access to information in our language.
The other hands, the motion is on the table. Looks like we're going to have a vote. Madam Clerk.
Shall I proceed with the vote, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Ms. Jones?
You're on mute still. Your mute's on, Yvonne.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I vote against the motion.
Monsieur Lefebvre?
Contre.
Mr. May?
Against.
Mr. Sadu?
Against.
Mr. Weiler?
Je suis contre.
Mr. Lloyd?
Against.
Mr. McLean?
Contre.
Mr. Patzer?
Against.
Mr. Zimmer?
Against.
Monsieur Simard?
Pour.
Monsieur Cannings?
Je suis contre la motion.
That's 10 nays, 1 yay.
Okay, motion defeated. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Okay, so our witnesses have been released, so that's all our business today. So I will adjourn the meeting and look forward to seeing everybody on Friday. Thank you all.